And as those documents are being passed out, I think everybody gets a folder.
Pass it around. We'll do it that way.
Do I get one or?
Yeah, you.
Oh, let's have one too.
Then I have a couple of extra if we need them.
Okay.
The one
So we've had a working group meeting in which we worked through the material in preparation for tonight's meeting. And I'm going to turn it over to Tim in just a moment. I think he'll get us oriented on what we're trying to accomplish tonight. The focus tonight, though, is on the question of the spectrum of affordability. So it's question 12 on the council's list, the council and school board's list of key questions. And so that will be kind of, I think, where we'll spend most of our time tonight, and we'll try to check off a few extras as well. And let me turn it over to Tim, and he'll lay it out for us.
Perfect. Thank you, Wyatt. Really excited to be back here. I think, as you all saw in the last joint session, the working group has been making a lot of progress, being very diligent, working through these questions, making sure that we have the right information, making sure we're discussing the key points of it, and then bringing it back to this group to share. So we wanted to make sure that December continues to be productive, and even though this meeting was only a few days after our last working group meeting, we wanted to make sure we had a chance to get this information in front of you, because the financial modeling and the financial numbers are so crucial and so at times complex. So Wyatt and his team with the city put together the financial modeling to take a look at the debt service for the city and to look at the question of affordability, which he'll break down as what can we factually, legally afford, what can we borrow under our current policies, and then with some creative modeling, what could we get to and what numbers could we achieve if we have a little bit of flexibility in some of those policies. So the updated materials you have before you are focused on question 12. You'll see an updated questions list that's just to make sure everyone has the most current list of questions for the full spectrum. You'll see a sheet similar to what you had for the school board ones. It's question 12, and it breaks down all of the subsets of the question, as well as a very brief bullet of answers. This is your quick and dirty version to say what we can afford currently and what we might be able to do to borrow a little more, as well as a list of the additional items. If you turn that page, what you have before you is a little bit more detailed breakdown of each part of question 12 and everything it gets into. A reminder, that's 12A, how much can we afford right now with our current policies? 12B, if we break policy, what can we afford? What are the repercussions of breaking policy? 12C, how much could we afford if we change policy? 12D, are there TIFs, special tax districts, or additional creative funding methods available? 12E, is $120 million possible? What are the bonding and development implications to ensure a stable future for Falls Church? 12F, what are the tax implications of each tier across the spectrum? And 12G, what are the debt timelines associated with each funding option? Because most of these questions are interrelated, you'll see them played out over some different charts and graphs that Wyatt will walk through in his presentation. And if you flip past this breakdown of details, you have a copy of that presentation as well, so you can follow along with a handout. After the presentation, which is 21 slides, there are a couple of tables that have the raw numbers of what this would look like in a debt service table. Wyatt will have some updated versions of those that are color-coded to guide you through the numbers. And then following that, there is the explanation of tax increment financing and community development authorities, and then a risk analysis memorandum from Davenport and Company. So it's a comprehensive packet. What I'll be doing as we go along is marking down anything Wyatt says that may need further attention for the working group. And as we have questions and discussion afterwards, we'll make sure that we take any additional questions or considerations that you all have back to the working group to either get more details or to clarify anything as needed. So with that, Wyatt, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Tim. So we'll focus on this question of affordability, and I'll just say at the outset, it's been a very busy couple of weeks for Melissa and the finance team, because they really worked hard to pull this information together for you. I'll I drew the straw to present this information. Melissa will present the FY18 budget projections, which will be after we're finished with the campus planning. So in terms of affordability, we've broken it into sort of two big groups of how we assess the affordability of the city's capital program. And on the factual basis, we can look at industry metrics, and then arguably on the opinion side of it is really a political question of what is reasonable for the taxpayers of Falls Church to shoulder. When you're talking about debt, if you're willing to raise the tax rates to pay all the debt service, then a lot of these industry metrics, which are metrics of risk, go away. But there's a lot of political risk and other sort of permutations of risk in asking the taxpayers to pick up such a big burden. So we try to measure that burden in the following 4 ways in this presentation. Debt to assessed value is a very traditional way to evaluate risk. Assessed value of real estate is the basis of most of the revenue for the city, 60% of our revenue. There's a state law cap that you cannot have debt that exceeds 10% of the assessed value of your jurisdiction. We currently have an assessed value of just under $4 billion, and so that would be a cap of $400 million of debt. That's a very big cap. The city's policy is 5%, half what the state law cap is, or $200 million of debt. We'll run right up to that policy cap with if the full CIP is adopted, we're put into place. Debt service to total expenses. This is a metric that we look at with every year's CIP. Currently, 8% of our budget goes to debt service. Our policy cap is 12%. There is no state law on this limitation. Payout ratio. What this stands for is how much of your debt is retired after 5 years, how much of your debt is retired after 10 years. Our policy today is that 1/4 of your debt should be off your books. It should be retired after 5 years, and half of it should be retired after 10 years. What that basically stands for is we typically structure our debt as 20-year term debt. That comes into play because we've discussed potentially doing the high school with 30-year debt. And then lastly, debt per capita is something that bond rating agencies and investors look at. We'll show some regional comparisons, but there's no law or policy cap that speaks to this. And then we'll run some scenarios in terms of using our debt service model, how many pennies on the tax rate, or what's the impact on the average homeowner's tax bill. So let's start the discussion just by looking at what we have on the books today. We have $51.6 million of debt. About 75% of that is for school facilities. About 25% of that today is for general government facilities. And this is the debt service for that $51 million of debt that we currently have outstanding. It's just over $6 million in the current fiscal year. The purple line in this chart is the 12% of expenditures policy limit. And that's the first policy limit that we bump up against when we consider our capital improvements program. So on the question, the sub-question of question 12, I'm sorry, I'm not there yet. So we've modeled 2 scenarios. One is a policy constrained scenario, which is what's the maximum amount of debt that we could issue under existing city policies. And the one that we bump up against first is 12% of expenditures. The answer to that question is $70 million. That's how much additional debt capacity we have under that policy. If we took the adopted CIP, we have $30 million of projects that are for the library, for the City Hall project, for the purchase of land for schools, for other miscellaneous issues and projects in the CIP. That would leave $40 million. If that was left unchanged, that would leave $40 million for the high school project. Okay, 70 in total, $40 million for the high school project if nothing else was changed. The other that we model is the adopted CIP, and that is $145 million of total debt issued over the 5-year period. $114 million is modeled for the high school project, and $31 million for the remainder of the CIP for the items I just listed. So just so everybody understands the assumptions that we're using in all of these scenarios, so on the two that we're running, we have the 12% policy limit scenario and the adopted CIP scenario. So under the 12% policy limit, that's $70 million of debt that we'd issue. We'd have a 4% interest rate. Assessed value of the city's real estate will grow at 2.5% per year. Our operating budgets will grow at 2.5% per year. The main issue there is that our operating budgets are going to be covered by economic growth. That's the main issue of that assumption, that there's no pennies in the tax rate for our operating budgets. It's only for the capital program. Other funding sources to help cover debt service costs in the 12% policy limit, there are none. We just play it the way we would traditionally finance our CIP and have done for years. And then we have an assumption for future borrowing after the 5-year planning period that $5 million would be issued every other year beginning in FY22. And so you'll see those numbers when we look at the graphs. So in the adopted CIP scenario that we run, the full $145 million is issued. We also have a 4% interest rate. AV and operating budgets are the same. The debt structure is stretched out, so it's not a 20-year term, but it's a 30-year term. And instead of using level principal payments, we use level debt service payments for the $114 million for the high school. The rest of the CIP, the other $31 million, is financed the way we traditionally do, with 20-year debt. Now, the key thing that we do for the adopted CIP scenario is we use the capital reserves of $9 million. That's where the level is today. We use that to buy down the debt service and shave the peak. And we also plug in land proceeds, which we've just modeled as $30 million. Now, we've discussed it being $40 million. We have discounted that because that one issue about infrastructure cost is one that we want to work out as we go through our planning process. So we've been conservative, and we've modeled that as a $30 million land proceeds scenario. We also model it as coming in 3 installments beginning in FY22. So we issue the debt first, and then these payments come in. We do not model future taxes from future development. We can handle that in the planning process, but just for this initial run, we don't model that. Okay, so those are the assumptions. Things that we don't include, again, new taxes from development on the campus. We don't model operating budgets increasing as a result of the new building. That's a pretty important issue that's, I think, on the council's list, and we have not yet addressed that to try to model what the operating budget costs would be if you have a bigger facility. And if there's a new major capital improvements program, like an $18 million elementary school expansion or things like that that have been discussed, that is not in this model yet. That's not in the adopted CIP, and that information, I think, is evolving. So that's out for now. Okay? So if we chart out our, yes.
Can we just pause for a minute? I just want to make sure that I'm understanding everything and everyone else in the room is too. So to go back to the original question sheet, specifically 12A, the very simple question of how much can we afford right now with our current policies?
Yes.
The answer is $40 million. If we change no policies to stay within our 12% debt limit, it's $40 million. Is that the simple version?
It's $70 million in new capacity, so if you don't change any other aspect of the CIP except for the high school project, you have $40 million for a high school.
Okay. And if we don't deprioritize anything else in the CIP,
that's correct.
And it's 40 left.
That's correct. Okay. All right, so this is the debt service chart of the blue bars down here. You saw in that initial chart, that's your existing debt service. We have a major step down in FY22, and Mary Ellen Henderson comes off the books in FY 2025. So for $70 million of additional debt, that would increase our annual debt service up to about $12 million a year, or roughly a doubling of our existing annual debt service. As we note here, that if you don't change the CIP, that'd be $30 million for the CIP and $40 million for the school project. And then this light blue in the out years is the new debt service for issuing $5 million of debt every other year. So that's what we're calling the policy, 12% policy constrained scenario. And then the full adopted CIP has all the existing debt service. It has the City Hall project. It has miscellaneous school projects like the purchase of additional land. And then we have the library here. It's the green bars. That's the debt service for that. And then the red is the debt service for the George Mason High School project. And the light blue is the same as modeled in the last one. So in our peak years, we exceed the 12% of expenditures policy limit by about $3 million per year. So let's look at some of the metrics that the industry would use to evaluate the risk of this amount of debt. We're going to compare ourselves against a basket of localities in Northern Virginia, starting with Purcellville, Manassas Park, Vienna, Herndon, City of Fairfax, Winchester, Fredericksburg, Manassas, Leesburg, Alexandria, Arlington, Loudoun, Prince William, and Fairfax. So in terms of total debt outstanding, obviously the larger jurisdictions have more debt. A more useful comparison is how much debt do they have on a per capita basis. So on average, there's just over $3,000 per capita debt in the Northern Virginia region. Currently, the city is just slightly above the average of this basket of localities that we're comparing ourselves against. With the full CIP, we would be almost 3 times the average, almost $12,000 of debt per capita. And if we went all the way up to our policy limits, we would be just over $6,000 of debt on a per capita basis. Now, Purcellville and Manassas Park do have higher ratios than that currently, but that would be significantly higher than average. So that is that's one metric, and it fairly well captures the scale of the capital improvements that we're contemplating. Yes.
Another assumption that we talked about in the working group that's not in there is that the population will keep growing.
That is correct.
Right.
So we're assuming that our population is going to grow roughly aligned with the other jurisdictions in this area. So these metrics wouldn't change significantly on the population side. They would change much more quickly on the debt side. Fairfax City is one that we look at as a pretty good comparison for us. They have a high debt per capita, and they had a very ambitious capital program where they built a new police station, a new high school, a new library, and they renovated and expanded their city hall, all in a very short period of time. And we've toured many of those facilities, but that was their big capital lift, and they did that in the 2008 to 2010 timeframe. All right, debt to assessed value. Thank you. Debt to assessed value. So here is the city's policy limit at this red bar at 5% of assessed value. So if we adopt the full CIP, we would be just below that policy constraint. The average for the region is about just under 2.5% of assessed value, and currently we're below average and at just over 1% of our debt is 1% of our total assessed value. Yes. Mm-hmm.
This is based on what the worst case scenario is for us, vice the current indicators for each of the other jurisdictions, right? I'm curious what the city of Fairfax was
when
it first completed, as opposed to now. I assume that it's certainly its debt per capita was higher than it is now.
That is correct. They have paid off now 5 years of their debt, and for instance, and with this metric, their assessed value has grown since they issued their debt. So this would have been a more stark picture for the city of Fairfax at the time that they were doing their heavy lift. I don't have that chart. We could go back in time to look at it, but Davenport, who is our financial advisor, was Fairfax Cities at the time, so they're very conversant with when they were grappling with their challenges and how they looked at it. Okay, debt service versus expenditures. The 12% limit is shown here as the red bar here on the x-axis. So the average for Northern Virginia is just over 8% of budgets goes to debt service. We're below that average today, and at our policy constraint, we would come. This is the marker that limits how much debt, so we go right up to it, and then the full CIP would get us up to about 15% of our budget would go to debt service, and that would be higher than any jurisdiction in Northern Virginia. Now, the 10-year payout ratio, this really is a measure of, for your successors, what position will they be in 10 years? They will have capital challenges, they'll have budgetary challenges, and so how much of their debt will be paid off, of the debt that we would be issuing for this project will be paid off in 10 years. So in this one, a high number is good, and a low number is a sign of a lack of flexibility or lack of room to maneuver in the out years. So on average, the Northern Virginia jurisdictions would have, in 10 years out, 70% of their debt will be paid off. We're above average currently. We'll have just under 80% of our debt will be paid off in 10 years. The policy constraint would be right at 50%. And the full CIP, only about 1/3 of our debt would be paid off at year 10. And so that's another one of our policies that we're bumping up against with the full CIP. All right, let's look at the question of affordability from a real estate tax rate perspective. Currently, our tax rate is, and we'll cover this with some other charts when we get into the FY18 budget presentation, but we're lower than some of the smaller jurisdictions, and we're higher than all of the larger jurisdictions in terms of our current real estate tax rate. With the policy constrained limit, what this stands for, remember, is if we take a very traditional approach to financing all of our capital needs, and so that actually results, even though it's a smaller amount of debt that's being issued, and a higher tax rate required to service that debt than the full CIP, because we model some things like using land sale proceeds and capital reserves to pay down the debt service in the peak years. So the way we've modeled this, the full CIP actually has a lower tax rate. It's certainly subject to a lot of discussion. It's a key thing that everybody understand exactly how that works. And so for more detail on that, we do have a detailed chart of how the tax rates would work, and that is in your handouts. Did we ever get a copy version, a color version? Okay. Let me pass out this one. It didn't print in color, but it has a slightly larger font size, so it's a little bit easier to read. While it's being passed out, I'll put it up on the board as well.
This is a larger font.
Sorry. When we were with the working group, there's a recognition that we need to present this better, but I have a hard time breaking out. I feel like it's very important for the council and the school board to understand in a granular way how this all works before sort of making big statements about it sort of in the simplicity of a PowerPoint presentation. All right. Share drive. So in the scenario that this is basically a model run with a summary sheet that is kicked out by the model. So if we issue 30-year debt for, and I'll start up at the upper left-hand corner and just walk us through this chart. If we issue 30-year debt for the high school and for Mary Ellen Henderson, and 20-year debt for the rest of the CIP, and we use the capital reserves to pay annual debt service, particularly in the peak years, and we include the proceeds from the sale of land, that's what this model run will show. So it assumes that next year that we go to referendum and the voters approve the project at the full CIP amount. In order to get through the initial planning and the architectural and engineering, we would issue debt in FY18 in the amount of $10.2 million. And then in 2019, we'd be getting into construction, so we would issue $56 million in 2019, and then $47 or $48 million in the year 2020. Again, it would all be issued at 4% interest rates. That's their assumption. And then the rest of the CIP would be issued per the schedule of the CIP. So then if you look at the main chart and follow the fiscal years down from 2018 all the way out through 2040, our total debt service peaks out at $15.3 million, and that's the first shaded box. So that's 6.7 million higher, I'm sorry, 7.9 million higher than our current debt service. So in order to pay for that, in FY19 at a minimum, there would need to be 8 pennies on the tax rate. And what that would generate is just over $3.2 million. And you would contribute in FY19, a sizable amount of that would be contributed to the capital reserve balance. So your capital reserve balance would go up to $10.7 million. Then in subsequent years, you would use those capital reserves, you would draw down from the capital reserves to smooth out your debt service payments. So it would go down to $9 million, and then so it's $3.7 million. And the next shaded box, however, we have the first of the $10 million payments for the sale of land coming into the capital reserve, so that bumps that figure up to $8.7 million. That's the red shaded square on the television. Then we continue to draw the reserves down at a pretty significant clip of over $4 million per year. And then the second payment for the sale of land comes in FY 2024, and then the third payment comes in FY 2026. And we'll refine these modelings as we go through our planning process for the site. This is a fairly simple 3-phased commercial development program up on the campus, and so the land proceeds are tied to that basic notion. And so then if you look at the metrics that are laid out in the columns to the right, our payout schedule, we would have paid off 19% of our debt at year 2023 and 35% of our debt at year 2028. Those ratios should be 25% and 50% respectively per policy. The impact on the median homeowner's tax bill at 8 cents on the tax rate would be $544. Now this is not cumulative, this is each year. And so don't add those numbers together. We're not talking about 8 pennies and then another 8 pennies. We're talking about 8 cents. That gets you through the first 2 years. And then per this model, if there are no other needs for tax rates and all these assumptions play out, then you're able to reduce the tax rate because those capital reserves kick in and start to pay off the peak of the debt service. A couple of the other columns, and I'll stop on this. I know this is a busy chart. It's got a lot of things going on in it, but it's important to understand how these things work. So our debt per capita, which we've talked about, that goes up to that $11,967 dollar amount in year 2020. That's the figure that's roughly double anyone else in the region. And then our operating and total budget would go up to $100 million, and we would exceed debt service would exceed our policy target and go up to 15% in those years between 2021, 2022. And then it would start to come down basically as the natural growth of our budgets begin to catch up with it. So that's just one, this is sort of the full CIP model run. The key thing to understand about it is the importance of those capital reserves. And that's the essential element of how that option becomes remotely affordable.